Good afternoon and welcome to the February MASC Learning Lunch. We're glad that you were able to be part of our session here today. And while we know there's lots and lots that's going on in the universe right now, we also know that one of the things that remains universal and remains constant on everyone's mind is school budget season. And so we are thrilled to be able to have Colin Jones from the Mass Budget and Policy Center with us today, who's going to talk about the sort of the state budget picture and school finance. And he is happy to take your questions. So we've got that open as well. I'll be keeping an eye on that, as will Colin. And he's planning on taking most questions at the end. But if we see anything we need to jump on right away, we'll do that too. Colin, over to you.
All right. Thanks for having me. And of course, if Tracy wants me to cover something, I'm there. So no, it's really exciting to be with all of you and to some of us may have been together at the conference in November. Obviously lots happened since then. So yeah, I'm going to just do about 20 minutes on just the state budget in general, the process, the K-12 budget in general, Chapter 70, and then some of the more newsy stuff that's going on in both Healy's budget for fiscal 26 and then the legislature's version. And then also there's a lot going on actually in supplemental spending as well. That's pretty important. So, all right, so give me 1 second to get the slides going. Okay. Oops. Okay. All right, so hopefully this works for people who've been doing this for a while and maybe even some newer people. So I'll go through some of the basics here, and then we'll get more into we can get deeper as we go in further. So yeah, as far as so Mass Budget's a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and so I've been the K-12 and education analyst for about 10 years. So as a budget analyst, I think of the state budget as all the inputs that are going on, state taxes, user fees for things like the RMV and licenses, and then federal funding, and then all those things going into the state budget and then going out across, all the programs, schools, housing, parks, um, transit, local aid, all the things that we have to get done as a state. And so, yeah, as an analyst, I do think of it as like, 300 pages of the budget and, thousands of lines of data. But we also always want to remember, and this in a state budget or in local, that we want to start with value. So it's we have a choice. We're making choices about what we want for our community, which things are so important that we're not just going to leave them up to chance. We're not just going to leave them up to where you happen to be born. You're going to make sure that through the state budget we are having a level playing field and adequate funding for schools, which we all believe in, is a huge part of that. And so, again, as an analyst, as a policy nerd, I often jump right to, what are the new programs and the numbers. But we do want to start with where the values we're bringing to the table. And I think with all the policymakers and folks in this field, like we get up in the morning to make sure that every kid has a great opportunity. And that's why we're all here. So, um, not to go back on that, but as far as this is the revenue pie for Massachusetts. We so um, the majority of it is state and local taxes. It's mostly income taxes and sales taxes are kind of the biggest ones. That's nearly 60% of revenue. Federal revenue, so funds from the federal government, is about a quarter of the state budget, or about $15 billion. Um, Obviously, we've been looking at this very intensely over the past few weeks, and it's something we have to keep an eye on, as we're seeing shifts and freezes and changes. Um, we will just have to kind of keep an eye on things, and but it, is obviously very important, and for for healthcare, for transportation, a whole range of things. But for education, we're talking Title One, IDA, a bunch of programs that are really important. So like user fees, like again, you're going to the DMV and paying for get a new license, that type of stuff is about 10%. And then a lot of like snazzy new age stuff like Airbnb and Uber and casinos and cannabis and stuff is a small part of the budget. It's about 7%. So, um, so the news to how much money it is ratio is a little uh, skewed there. Okay, so as far as the budget process, we're always in some stage of the budget process. It is a cycle. We're always in some step of it. So right now, we had the governor's budget about 3 weeks ago, and then we are moving towards the House Budget Committee, Ways and Means Committee, releasing its plan in the middle of April. Then we'll go to the Senate a month later, um, and then by June, we're going to be the Senate and House have to appoint 6 members to hash out the differences. Those do have to be ironed out because you're working from the same amount of money is being spent. So you've got to iron out those differences. Um, Governor Healy has the ability to override, to veto, but the legislature has the ability to override. And then if things are on time, that's a big asterisk. It'll be done by July 1st. That's the beginning of fiscal year 2026. So in practice, I don't even schedule vacations in July anymore. Because they have been doing it more like August 1st. So in that case, what happens is um, they do an extension. They basically extend the current budget another month, and it gets sorted out in the back end when they finish. But there is a challenge here. We should finish on time. We should not be like the last state in the country to finish our budget. The comptroller needs to close the books on the prior year. And there's always these sort of grumpy letters from the comptroller about why did we take so long? So there are some, it's certainly better to be kind of on time with that process. So we'll see how they do this year. Um, so, so in terms of the players involved, obviously, Governor Healy has a big role in kicking off this budget process. The Department of Administration and Finance sets the parameters of how much revenue we're expecting to have for the year. And then obviously they're executing as, in education, the Executive Office of Education, and the secretaries of DESE and EC and DHE are executing ed policy with the funding in the budget. So they're important. And even though, in Massachusetts state constitution, the governor is not as strong as in some states, and that's good for kind of, balance of power, but the governor still has an important role. And as far as the legislature is concerned, the top leaders is the speaker, Ron Mariano from Quincy. The second most influential position is the budget chair. Not surprisingly, you shepherd the $60 billion budget bill, so you have a lot of influence. That's Aaron Michaelwitz from Boston. On the Senate side, it's Senate President Karen Spilka, who's from Metro West, and Ways and Means Chair Mike Roderick, who's from Westport in the South Coast. So, and then every one of us has our own senators and reps that we can that are there to work for us. And so you can all, I'm sure you're as school committee members are well aware of your presence in the community. So as far as this year, so fiscal 25, the year we're currently in now, this school year, in terms of the things that were going on, so it was year 4 of the Student Opportunity Act this year. Out of there's 6 years total, so fiscal 27 is going to be the final year of phase in. Beyond, I mean, the SOA was really important in adding hundreds of millions of dollars in school funding. Beyond that, though, there wasn't that much else they were doing on sort of Chapter 70. There was a little bit added for adding to the head count of low-income kids, and then there was about $37 million in minimum aid. So that's not that much sort of added to the process when you have a $6 billion formula. So one thing that didn't happen this year is updating Chapter 70 to reflect the crazy amounts of inflation that has happened in the last 3 or 4 years. And so that's just not been done. And so that's something that we'll talk about what they're doing with that and the impact that's having. So on the positive side, with the millionaire's tax or fair share coming online, we're continuing to do programs like universal school meals and a bunch of other things. And one thing that I would say we as budget hawks were looking at was, we only budgeted $1.3 billion in millionaire's tax in fiscal 25. although we have been raising closer to, we've been raising over 2 billion from this tax. So that's just telling us like there's a lot of potential to do more. And this will also come up in thinking about this year. So just again, fair share is a positive story as far as thanks to voters passing it, we have all these new resources, and this is what sort of the breakdown of what we did this year. So it's about 40% transportation and about 20% in each area of education. There's certainly a conversation about what's the appropriate split between transportation and education, as well as in the different branches of education. That's going to continue to be something we have to watch. And there's no like right answer. It's kind of just going to be part of the process. And I rather have that problem of dividing this great new progressive resource than not. So this is the K-12 budget right now in fiscal 25. Um, and it is so chapter 70, 6.9 billion, obviously the largest game here in town. And who was it? It was Jeff Wolfson, the former associate commissioner of DESE, always made sure that I had to include the teacher pension number. So technically, teacher pensions are 2.8 billion. It's in the pension line items, but it's for retired teachers, so you can consider education. Um, every single other program that DESE does, the administration itself, MCAS, circuit breaker, charter schools, everything is that 1.3 orange slice that DESE has more sort of control over because it's not driven by formulas. It's not that much though. So even within that 1.3, a lot of them are formulas as well. And then the MSBA is 1.3. And I don't have to remind you guys about what school building costs are. We're in a world where I think a single high school in Lowell or Somerville cost $400 million. So we do have to really ask ourselves about how far is this MSBA funding going um, these days and times. So as far as Chapter 70 is concerned, um, so folks have probably seen me do this before, but I'm just going to walk through sort of how Chapter 70 works and how it's working now. And my two example communities will be Lawrence and Watertown, and go through sort of the steps of how it works. Those are intentionally very different communities with different profiles to kind of illustrate some of the issues. Obviously, there's a whole range of communities and different layers of this between these two poles that I'm going to explore. All right, so this is going to be per pupil funding for Lawrence and Watertown in Chapter 70. There's a lag on that data. So we're in fiscal 25. So DESE's not reported where the dust settles with all the spending in fiscal 25 because we're still in fiscal 25. So this is from last year. And so this is halfway through the SOA. So step one, we have, so Chapter 70 outlines the required elements of school funding, what is constitutionally required to provide kids an adequate education. It's expressed in sort of a grid where one way going down is all the types of kids you have, pre-K, K, middle, high school, voc, special ed, and then some incremental rates like low income, ELL. And then going the other way is all the areas of spending and funding that you need. So teachers, administrators, student services, and you for every city has one. You just look it up. But the sort of summary of all the types of kids you have and all the cost areas you need sum up to the foundation budget, which is the practical, legally required floor of spending. And so this is just the foundation budget for each of those towns divided by their head count to make it comparable. So, okay, so the Lawrence Foundation budget is about 19,000 per student, to about 15,000 in Watertown. And that's reflecting, more ELL students, more low-income students. That is sort of what you would expect. So that's the first step. And the second step, there is a set formula that looks at the total income and property wealth of each of those communities, and a percentage of it is what is considered what they can afford to contribute towards their foundation budget. That's less than $1,000 per kid in Lawrence, and it's about 12,000 per kid in Watertown. And then in the third step, the gap between what a city can raise and what it needs in its foundation budget is filled with Chapter 78. So it's over 18,000 for Lawrence compared to about 3,000 for Watertown. And so Mass Budget works with allies and colleagues around the states, around the country. And this model where it's there's a hard guaranteed floor and an extremely progressive way to distribute funding that's guaranteed and never goes down to the communities that need it the most. That is something that many of our of our colleagues would be very happy to have. But we know that there's challenges as well, and a lot of it comes in the fourth unofficial step where cities are putting in more um, using local resources like property taxes. Um, so Watertown is putting about 9,500 in extra local spending, all for wonderful things. I actually used to live in Watertown. It's great new school buildings, staff, language programs, enrichment programs, all great stuff. But as we know, Lawrence doesn't have the capacity to spend that way. So even halfway through the SOA, there's still a gap, and Watertown's spending about 126% of what Lawrence is spending, and that's not the design of the formula. That's kind of practically how it happens. And not to say that we think that Lawrence will ever spend at sort of a higher income suburb level, but addressing this is why we did the SOA in the first place. So this was the situation before the SOA. So look how much smaller the the aid bar is for Lawrence, and it was Watertown was at 160% of Lawrence, so a 40 percentage point difference now that we were halfway through the SOA. So again, that's the SOA working as intended. Again, sometimes people get mixed up on this. Not that it's perfect and everything's fine right now, but just that is the intention of the SOA. It's working as intended in that way. So just a little bit about what came out in the preliminary numbers and at the end of January. So for Lawrence, it's a very kind of gateway city profile here. Year 5 of the SOA is adding about 32 million in the foundation budget, and like nearly all of it is Chapter 70. And so again, Lawrence is on the way end of like 90+% state responsibility just based on the wealth profile. However, one thing again we've been looking at is that how much more would cities be getting if we had inflated everything to match the crazy COVID inflation? What we found, this is just Lawrence, but there's a chart you can look at for any district that we can circulate. Basically, this is sort of saying like we basically ran simulations last year that was sort of like what was the world before SOA, the SOA as we're doing it, and then the SOA if we had properly inflated everything. So we found that if you look at fiscal this year, which is the blue bars, SOA is adding about $54 million to Lawrence, but it would have added another $15 million if we'd properly accounted for inflation. And the yellow bars is projected out to the end of the SOA. Things get a little more fuzzy as you project further. The differences with what actually happens get a little bit larger. So, and it's obviously not just Lawrence. This was sort of the bottom line finding of that report last year was that the SOA is increasing aid by over $900 million as of this year, and it will go above $1 billion in 26. But we would be adding more, somewhere between 400 to 450 or 460 million more if we had just inflated things to what actually happened in the economy. And so that benchmark of like the structural problem of not inflating everyone's rates and funding is a story that I'll close with kind of what's going on in the 26 budget in general, based on what Governor Healy did. So it's year 5 of the SOA of 6. And instead of again, like 45 million last year, this year was about 45 million of different things we added to try to help districts. Healy proposed 275 million in new grants that are kind of focused on cost growth areas like transportation, circuit breaker, special education, and school building. So that's a totally different ballgame than what we were talking about this time a year ago. So there's clearly an understanding that there's problems out here that we need to work on. It's not directly addressing the root of it, of underinflation, and then there's broader issues, obviously rural schools, cost of special education, there's a whole bunch of other structural things that we're not dealing with by just patching some grants, even though they're good. It's more kind of like the downstream problems that we're working on. Positive story. So after us kind of waving a stick at the cloud, talking about we need to spend the fair share funds that are coming in, the governor is coming around there, and she budgeted 1.95 billion in fair share, so that's 650 million ongoing resources from the millionaire's tax that she used this time. And then positively, there's also a companion bill to use 1.32 billion of last year of prior funds that we should have spent, but didn't because we were being cautious, as a companion to the budget. And you really have to look at them together. We have to look at the budget and this companion supplemental bill to really get what they're doing. Um, so as far as just like with this year's, this kind of the breakdown for Healy's budget in the main regular 26 budget. It's kind of 40% transportation, 60% education with the split. But then there's this supplemental. Sorry, higher education folks, you didn't get anything in the supplemental, and I think some groups are probably mad about that. But which I understand from a higher ed perspective. But they said in their supplemental, it was actually in Worcester at their event on January 14th. They said we're going to make this supplemental more transportation. It's going to be less education because we're going to balance it a little bit back towards transportation. But some of the stuff they were doing was in this supplemental. So, and the House and Senate don't have to do the supplemental the exact way she did. They do have to do something because we can't leave a 1.32 billion lying around for no reason, but they'll have their own take on what they're going to do. So a few next steps before we do questions. Um, this is a very, very tough environment. So kids are still coming off the pandemic. We need more services and support. Inflation's still crazy. I hope it actually stays down. I mean, if we have a trade war, that's probably not going to help. So we'll see. Costs are very high. Even before the events of the last few weeks about it was already like, it's not that costs were going down, it's just they were not growing the way they had been. And there's all this expired COVID funding that we have to, that supported a lot of programs that's now gone. So just in terms of what's going to come, and this will be stuff to figure out like the rest of the budget process and the legislative session. Now it's like very active time to figure out how the House is going to put together its budget right now. They're going to start hearings, all that fun stuff. So some things we could do. I mean, obviously we could look at the structural issues like fixing Chapter 70 inflation. That'd probably take a couple of years. Like no one's jumping up and down to give me the $450 million I need to fix that for some reason. And then there's the approach that Healy sort of took, where we're going to look at some of the cost drivers in transportation, special ed, rural aid, school building, and all of those will ease pressure on city budgets to have more options to cover kind of the crazy costs that you're facing. In the longer term, there's talk of convening a commission to, because it's been 10 years since time flies, since the last um, Chapter 70 commission. So there's a bunch of things we can look at, like, is the state local split working? It's like the 59-41 split between town and state. Is that working? Is the 17.5 minimum for high wealth districts, even if they're rich enough to pay for more than they would get less aid than that still exists as a minimum? How's that going? Is special education enough? In general, all those sort of big picture issues could be discussed in a commission. There's a time horizon problem there where last time it was commission completed in fiscal 15, and it wasn't until fiscal 21, or I guess 20 for being generous, that anything happened. So that took 5 or 6 fiscal years, and then another 6 to actually phase in the SOA. So just being realistic about the time and study it takes to do those things. So as far as us, we have tools online at massbudget.org. Please sign up for our email list. We do an analysis of every budget coming out, and we're glad to partner with Anthony and Tracy and Glenn and all the team. And so just, yeah, we have tools on our website. You can track budget numbers. You can reach out to us. We're here to help out and as part of our mission. So so I will stop there and see what you guys want to chat about.
So right now we don't have any outstanding questions, but we want to encourage you guys to use the Q&A. Someone immediately wanted to use your slides because that's always the first question anyone always asks. I also, oh, by the way, I wanted to, Jeff Wolfson, I also cite every single time I do the presentation because my pie chart likewise has teacher pension and MSBA because he was the one who told me I needed to put that in a footnote.
Yeah, Jeff's off somewhere retired, hanging around Brookline, but now we're still
He
remembering.
lives on in the footnotes.
Yeah, exactly. Good times.